Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Link's Awakening. When pundits speak of innovation in gaming, their thought processes tend to fit nicely and neatly into one of two categories. They either focus purely on the technical side, the graphics and processing and interface, or they focus purely on the storytelling aspect, pondering how narratives in gaming can mature beyond excuse plots, how they can become singular and unique. These two categories are not equal, of course. The first represents a cold, unfeeling, almost technocratic approach to innovation, the same drive that leads tech companies to add a single additional new feature and a slightly cleaner presentation and demand that consumers pay hundreds of dollars for their quote-unquote new product. The second advocates for moving beyond the traditional gaming tropes, recognizing that gaming is a young, rising medium with a vast reserve of untapped potential. This has led to some of the most fascinating games of the last decade, such masterful works as Journey and Life is Strange and Firewatch. There is a third approach, however, and it is this that I wish to call attention to in this analysis. Link's Awakening was one of the first games to successfully use a framework of traditional genre gaming, in its case, the action-adventure genre, for the purposes of subversion, analyzing not only the genre but the nature of gaming and player agency. More modern examples would include BioShock Infinite and, more obviously, Undertale. These games do not ignore the traditional structure of their genre, but rather analyze and question that structure. In Undertale, the traditional RPG dichotomy of good heroic humans versus evil bland monsters is subverted not only with distinctive memorable monsters that span the whole of the moral spectrum, but by the ambiguous nature of the protagonist. Player characters who are nothing but empty vessels for the gamer to control has been a gaming cliché for decades, but Undertale dares to question who actually controls these characters, criticizing the notion that the player necessarily has absolute power. At the conclusion of the genocide route, Chara has taken over Frisk's body. Chara asks the player if they want to destroy the world, but if the player says no, Chara responds that they never were in control. As for BioShock Infinite, while it skewers nativism and American exceptionalism, both hallmarks of the notoriously jingoistic FPS genre, it's at its most interesting when it attacks another of the genre's trademarks, clear demarcations of hero and villain, protected and protector. The game's protagonist, the repentant, rugged Booker DeWitt, is an alternate universe version of the game's antagonist, the fanatical Father Comstock. The decision that split the two was relatively benign. Father Comstock erased his old guild by accepting a baptism, while Booker refused the baptism and failed to cope with his guilt, drinking and gambling until he had accrued a huge debt, which he wiped away by selling his daughter, Anna. Elizabeth, the adult Anna, appears at first to be the traditional girl in the tower that needs to be saved, but throughout the adventure, she saves Booker as much as he saves her, and the two of them need each other, both in the narrative and the gameplay, to stay alive in the hazardous city of Columbia. An unnecessary companion she is not. So how does Link's Awakening fit into this? Well, while it's not as well written as the two aforementioned games, and it's still locked into the tropes of its series, it is a stronger subversion of not only gaming, but the agency of the gamer. For those who aren't aware, Link's Awakening is a series black sheep, the first of two. The second is Majora's Mask, a delightfully macabre entry with a unique structure in which the same 3 days are repeated over and over again until Link can stop the moon from crashing and destroying the land of Termina. As such, an immediate sense of dread pervades even the most innocent areas, such as Clock Town on day 1. The people sing and dance and make merry, but their actions are tinged by a layer of dramatic irony. They scoff at the threat posed by the moon, but by day 3 they will be terrified and regretful. For over a decade, the game lingered in obscurity, as it was too grim and dire to catch on. This isn't the stereotypical dark and gritty that marketers fawn over. This is genuinely disturbing. I'm not surprised that it took so long to become popular, but I'm glad it has finally garnered the acclaim it deserves. The same cannot be said of Link's Awakening, which remains relatively obscure. This owes partially to how dated the game feels. It's a Zelda game made for the Game Boy. Zelda is a sprawling series of high fantasy adventure. It's not a series made for handhelds, the original Game Boy least of all. The overworld is bland, and the dungeons are uninspired. To hook someone on Zelda, give them Ocarina or Breath of the Wild or Wind Waker. Do not give them this game. That said, it's one of the few entries in the series that presents itself as more than an extension of A Link to the Past or Ocarina. It dares to be different. There are enemies in this game that don't show up anywhere else in the series, but do show up consistently in the Mario franchise. The characters are not these intricately crafted bastions of complexity and depth, but they're pleasant enough to forge a connection between the player and Koholint Island. Without the game's major twist, it would have been resigned to a footnote in the history of one of gaming's most historic franchises, but there are worse fates. For the first 2/3, it's an enjoyable and nostalgic, albeit clunky, romp through an interesting, imaginative world. However, it's that last third that elevates the game into a challenging, thoughtful work of art. The game starts with Link being shipwrecked on Koholint Island while sailing home to Hyrule after grand adventures in foreign lands. This is straight out of the Odyssey, and like Odysseus, Link encounters a litany of strange and bewildering regions. His mission is to awaken the windfish that sleeps in a giant egg at the center of the island. Only then will he be able to escape and return to Hyrule. What is left unsaid is why he will be able to return. This unanswered question, combined with the steadily building sense that not all is as it seems on Koholint, provide the setup that makes the twist at the 2/3 mark so effective. The island is hiding a secret, and as a hero in an action RPG, it is the protagonist's duty to discover that secret. But this is not the typical gaming secret, where the player learns that the silver arrows are needed to defeat Ganon, or that they need to obtain the secret potion from Cynthia before they can clear out the Psyduck and progress down Route 210. No, this isn't a secret that inspires the player to act, but rather a secret that deters them from taking action. This is a secret that completely overturns the player's conception of the narrative they have been playing through. This is a quest of personal salvation, yes, but it is also a quest of widespread destruction. At the Southern Face Shrine, before Link enters the 6th of 8 dungeons, he finds an inscription that reveals the truth of the island. To the Finder, the island of Koholint is but an illusion. Human, monster, sea, sky, a scene on the lid of a sleeper's eye. Awake the dreamer, and Koholint will vanish much like a bubble on a needle. Castaway, you should know the truth! Yes, the entire island is a figment of the windfish's imagination, and when the player wakes up the windfish, the dream will end, and the entire island will be erased from existence. The owl that has been guiding Link throughout his journey claims that no one knows if the inscription is true. But this rings hollow. From the shrine's integral position in the game to the ongoing hints that Koholint Island hides a dark secret, the inscription has been built up to throughout the game and occupies a major place in its narrative. The inscription not being true would serve no purpose narratively, and it in fact would undermine the narrative structure of the game. If the protagonist continues their quest, the island will disappear. Marin and all the other characters that have been developed throughout the course of the game will be gone. In a scintillating subversion, the essential quest of the adventure game hero to collect enough MacGuffins to advance the narrative, in fact brings doom to the world. What makes Link's Awakening different from other subversive works is that there's nothing the player can do in response. The game is locked into a linear narrative. Unless the player decides to stop playing, they are destined to destroy the island. That is why the game can be classified as fatalistic. Games by their very nature place a heavy emphasis on self-determinism, the belief that the individual can substantially influence the world around them. Conflict is the heart of narrative, and conflict is driven by change, and that change in gaming is driven by the player, who takes control of a protagonist or a group of protagonists. In BioShock Infinite, Booker and Comstock may be two versions of the same character instead of diametrically opposed figures, but resolution can be reached, albeit at a great cost, as Booker drowns himself to stop the existence of Comstock. That's not the case in Link's Awakening. There's no catharsis, no satisfying conclusion. In Majora's Mask, the same 3 days may be repeated again and again, but a sense of progress still drives the narrative. Link explores Termina and clears dungeons in his ultimately successful quest to stop the moon from destroying Termina and defeat Skull Kid. In Undertale, the narrative is even more pliable. How the game progresses is entirely in the player's control. This encourages honest, moral gaming. The future is not set. If the player kills every monster in their path, they can destroy the world. But if they are earnest and pacifist, they can forge a better, more peaceful, more understanding world. In Link's Awakening, however, the actions of the player do not matter. Preserving Koholint Island while completing the game is impossible. Gaming bases itself on the underlying principle that the player's actions matter. Take Final Fantasy X or Xenoblade Chronicles, for example. In these games, there is a predestined, fated path, but the protagonists, by their bold actions, transcend that path and write their own destiny.
I will defeat sorrow in his place. I will stand my ground and be strong. I don't know when it will be, but someday I will conquer it. And I will do it without false hope.
Link's Awakening, however, condemns its protagonist to the role of destroyer. Link's actions save the Windfish, but kill the citizens and creatures of Koholint. This is not like Life is Strange, where the player has the opportunity to choose whether the life of a singular central figure is worth more than the lives of the many. Not only is there no choice in Link's Awakening, but the concept of choice in gaming is revealed to be but a facade. Choice is not inherent in gaming, and it is not absolute. It is a privilege the developer deigns to provide, and being a privilege, it can be revoked, forcing the player to trundle down a path they may despise for the purpose of completion. A player's role in gaming is necessarily fatalistic, as they are locked into a given role by the constraints of the narrative and of the concept. Games such as Undertale and Life is Strange attempt to release the player from these chains, but Link's Awakening provides an iconoclastic desecration of the concept of player agency, arguing that these chains are unbreakable, that the player cannot escape the subjugation of arbitrary narrative demands. Link's Awakening is one of those games that interests me more as an adult than it did as a child. I first heard of this game through my Ocarina of Time guidebook, and when I read the description of it, I thought to myself, oh, that sounds cool. but I don't want to play a Zelda game on the Game Boy. That was the extent of my comprehension. When I happened to back upon this game as a teenager who had already been exposed to a myriad of narratives about fate and free will and destiny, I found it much more interesting and played all the way through it. If I may offer one tip to those considering playing through this most distinctive entry in the Zelda pantheon, it's this. Don't expect the epic scale and intuitive gameplay that define the series. It's an experiment, more along the lines of Super Mario Land than Super Mario World, if you catch my drift. Don't go in expecting Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, and you'll be much happier. Manage your expectations. In fact, it might be helpful to forget this is a Zelda game at all. Think of it as a clever, subversive Zelda-esque work. What struck me hardest during my first playthrough was the agony of finishing the story knowing that the world was going to end when I did. If they had wanted to be nice, they would have sprung this twist on you at the end, but it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. By making the players spend 3 whole dungeons bearing the guilt that comes with knowing their mission will destroy the island, the game twists the knife in the player's stomach and makes them question the extent to which they're even capable of making choices in video games. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more dream-like content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that phantasmagorical stuff. Adios, comrades!